leading stories, trending topics, and changing narratives. Welcome back to another episode of the Critical Conversations podcast. I'm Dr. Rick Daniels, Director of Institutional Equity and Inclusion at Oakton College. Today, we'll be exploring a topic that's not only timely, but essential in the conversation around identity and inclusivity. The terms Latine and Latinx. As language continues to evolve, so do the ways we refer to our diverse identities. This episode will be an open dialogue about how and why these terms are used, what we understand about them, and their broader implications in creating inclusive spaces, especially within institutions like ours. Let's explore together how language intersects with identity and what steps we can take to foster inclusivity in our language moving forward. Joining us for this insightful conversation are some distinguished guests, Oakton students. That's right, we've got some students and some staff members here. They all bring a wealth of experience and knowledge, and we're going to hear from them right about now.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate that. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie Herrera. I am one of the learning support coordinators here at Oakton College. My pronouns are a, she, her, and I am very excited to be part of this conversation with you all.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gabriel Chacon. I am the equity coordinator for the ANDALE program, and I'm going to pass it on to the people for the reason on what we do and who we do it for, our amazing ANDALE students.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jorge Tercero. I identify, my pronouns are he, him. I am a sophomore here at Oakton, currently trying to finish my associates in applied science and then turning that into a bachelor in computer science, hopefully, right? Well, we're pushing forward towards it. Yeah. And now I'm going to pass it on.
Hi, my name is Omar Alanis. I am a freshman of Oakton College, and I'm very excited to be part of this discussion.
Hello, my name is Sandy Cardoso. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a queer Latina currently trying to get my child education degree here at Oakton.
Excellent. Thanks for joining us today. This conversation started at the institutional level when we were working on some external communications that go out to our external partners in the community. And we had some internal communications as well. And I had a conversation with Gabe because there were some communications that said Latinx. There were others that said Latine. And so I said, let's have a conversation about this as an institution. What should our stance be? How can we be more educated around this? And he was gracious enough to provide some information around that. I want to pose the discussion to you. Tell us and tell our listeners what we know. What do you know about these terms? What's their significance in different communities? What are your general thoughts on the utilization of them and how language is changing in general?
I'd like to start by sharing that I graduated from Northeastern Illinois University, and I was very involved in college. Part of my involvement, of course, include being part of Greek life. And I always told myself, I'm not going to be part of Greek life. I'm not going to pay to get friends, right? Those misconceptions of being part of Greek life. And then I became really involved with the what was known then the GLBTQA club. And there was a member that was trying to start a Greek organization centered on gender inclusive Greek organization. So it's the one and only Greek organization that centers on promoting and educating folks on the GLBTQIA community. And so that to me was different. I was already very involved with the club, and it was going to be a brand new chapter. And there are other co-ed, but we were going to be a sorority, right? Again, going back to the gender inclusivity part of it.
That's a new term. I've never heard of that term.
Yeah.
Can you say that one more time?
Sorority. Yep. So not a fraternity, right? Because again, there are other organizations that are co-ed fraternities, right? But again, centered on fraternity when there's other genders, right? So I became very interested in it, and sure enough, I joined Theta Pi Sigma. And we were very involved in terms of educating our community and EIU about, gender inclusivity. And back then, the term Latinx was huge, right? Like it traces back to years ago. And to me, that term was important for me personally to use because it was about gender inclusivity. And, whenever people would talk to me about, why do you use Latinx at that time, right? It was the simple answer for me was because it promotes gender inclusivity, period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's how I was introduced to it as well, as the X being a gender inclusive letter at the end of the term.
Yeah.
If I may say here, just to piggyback off what Stephanie was saying, so I was born and raised in Mexico, a very small little town called Atizapán de Zaragoza. And as far as, I made a comment to Gabriel earlier that the fact that we're having a conversation about inclusiveness now and terms like these, it's great because I remember coming here for the first time and on my Scantron or school application, having to write down, what am I? White, Hispanic? And that was about it, It wasn't until later where Latino or, we started seeing that more in applications. But I think as time goes on, these terms might change or it's more of a continuous conversation, more or less. I recently just came across Latine E, or I might not even be saying it right, or Latine A. Latine. And I remember Latinx being a thing in the early 2000s because I went to elementary school and, started seeing it more on shows or talking about it in smaller communities. But I myself identify as a Latino because I remember even just that term Latino already being inclusive, for everyone. However, I myself have friends who are non-binary, who might not identify with being a Latino or a Latina. And if they identify as, Latinx or Latin E, and we can have more inclusiveness, I support them, but that doesn't necessarily make me a Latin E, where I feel like the misconception is where when we ask, or I've seen videos online where, people are coming up to, Latinos and say, what do you think about Latinx? Or what do you think about Latin? And there's negative connotations towards it, but I don't think that this new movement is trying to change. It's not an umbrella. It's not trying to change the way we define ourselves. And if anything, the conversation alone, to me, feels like we're moving forward because we're trying to be more inclusive as a culture, where if you go to countries like Mexico, where I grew up from, and you have this topic or this conversation, some people, they not might look at you weird, but they might not necessarily know what you're talking about because it's something they've never heard, and vice versa. Just like there's still people coming here, and we are one of the fastest growing minority in this country. And we're only going to keep growing. So this is definitely a continuous conversation.
Me personally, I was introduced to the phrase Latinx when it started popping up everywhere around 2016, especially around Donald Trump and that kind of like culture war. And I know there was like obviously culture wars before, but that was like the first one that I was like seeing and experiencing my like firsthand, like seeing it online and everything. And I kept like seeing people, and it's still now like a lot of people, at least to me, it feels like a lot of people have, when they talk about why we shouldn't talk about or use Latinx or Latina, a lot of times it's like they have, like I can tell in the way that they are saying this that they're not like worried that it may have been like a sort of like a Western thing, which if you, at least while the origin is debated, at least a lot of places say that it started in LGBTQ plus communities in 2004. The way they speak about it, the way they talk about it, it seems like it's really like against wanting to include these people or include people who don't feel like they are in the gender they are assigned, or they don't fit into the into the two rigid boxes that we have of gender. It feels like they are just either like a lot of times it's coming from people who, based off like the other things that they've said, because I see the debate usually come from either someone who is kind of ignorant about that it's not trying to replace, or it's not trying to become like an umbrella, or like it's not trying to replace language. It's trying to add language to include people, and it is not trying to like change everything. It just wants a new title, or at least that's what I've seen. It's like people just want something something gender neutral to describe, because being called because I've seen it. I had this one friend, and he was a transgender, and I accidentally misgendered him, and you can see how much hurt that brings. So even with like normal language, like some people still feel like hey guys, or bro, or like it might cause them like some mental anguish hearing it. So just having a term that you can use so they can just describe themselves is I think a very good thing. And I see people just being against it, just being against like transgenderism, as like they like to call it, and being like there's only two boxes that you need to fit in. It feels like they're just trying to restrict people. That's what I've seen online, at least.
So it's a less restrictive term that advances the conversation, right? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yep. Yeah.
I think to be a little more clear about the new term that I personally just learned about this year, Latine, when I first saw it, I think it was maybe on LinkedIn. I'm like, oh my goodness, not another thing, you know? But then obviously it's about educating yourself, right? And I am a Latina, I'm a proud Latina, and I did my homework of learning more about, okay, why are we using Latine? And to me, there are two main reasons that also are, there's actual literature about this as well, that it promotes Spanish fluency, right? So going back to like what y'all are saying in terms of people feeling, because that's the con to it, right? People feeling disrespect, like we're disrespecting the language, right? Which I see, and I think that's just the Libra in me trying to see both sides. And I'm like, oh my goodness, no, but it takes educating like our older folks, right? Who are not in these environments, and letting them know like where it's coming from and where the world is at now, and integrating this new terminology or this additional option, right, of Latine, again, right, I think is going towards advancing, right, the conversation and keeping the conversation going of, okay, Latine now hopefully resonates more in terms of Spanish fluency, and like what was mentioned earlier, the integration of pronouns, right? The e part, because Latinx at first I'm like X, why we gotta be X, but obviously I adapted it. I still use that term more than Latine, and I think it could just be interchangeable, right? In terms of, okay, do we just use Latine? No, it's like, no, I try to be as inclusive as possible and say Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latine, right? So just make everyone happy in the room. But of course, when I'm referring to myself or someone who I already know what their pronouns are, then I feel confident to use Latina, Latino, etc. But I think at the end of the day, it's an opportunity to get to know people and how they identify.
And it's going to be a continuous discussion. And we, prior to coming, we were speaking about how this is just the beginning of the conversation. Right. This is, as humans, we are endlessly evolving. And just like as humans we evolved, vocabulary is evolving. And this is a prime example of what it is. The majority of people that I've seen, especially if they're coming from the native countries in Central and Latin America, these terms are so foreign to them. And it is a terminology that was created within Western society, right? It was brought in here from the US, that's where it was structured, and it started to become very popularized within the 2000s and 2010s. So it's very new. it's still very new, and it's going to take some time for this to either catch up, for people to start integrating it into their vocabulary, or there might be something new that comes up.
Yeah.
And that is the thing that we have to really be aware of, is this is the beginning of the conversation, but this isn't the end. And we don't know what might come up. We don't know how it's going to come up about, but I think that's the great thing about it, is that this is just the beginning, and to see where it might go is where the work really starts happening.
Yeah. We'll talk about the work, but I want to make sure I'm including
Sandy.
I believe there was one more comment. Yeah. Sandy, go ahead.
So I guess I just kind of wanted to like add my own thing on what was your name again? Sorry. Stephanie. Okay. You mentioned that when the term was first coming out, people were upset because they believed that it was changing the language. And I have first discovered these terms in 2020 specifically. And I remember seeing that argument everywhere, like people on Twitter or TikTok arguing like, oh, these Westerners are like colonizing this term and creating this term like out of thin air. But I think it's interesting because then it makes me realize that these people don't even really know their own culture, because this year specifically, I've been doing a deep dive into queer culture in Hispanic and Latino countries, like in Mexico and Ecuador. And it's incredible, like how much you'll find, like, and how many like indigenous beliefs have in common with queerness and gender identity. So wow. I think it's very interesting to me that people argue like, oh, these terms, like these are new, they're coming out of nowhere, when indigenous people for like years have identified as queer or gender that isn't normative to today. A great example is there is this indigenous group in Mexico, specifically in Oaxaca, called Mushe. And they recently actually released a Netflix series in which these indigenous group Mushe were prevalent to the story. And I think it was like so beautiful to see, because nobody knows about these people, yet they are actually highly respected in Oaxaca, Mexico. And I think it's just interesting to me that I feel like there are some Latinos in America who have like this elitism, and that they know more about their country than they actually do. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
It does.
Real quick though, can you say the name of that Netflix series?
Oh, it's called El Secretos del Rio, which means the secrets of the river.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to check that out. I encourage everyone to check that out. Before I get back to you, Gabe, something you said, Sandy, reminded me of a term, and I'm going to make somebody mad with this, because I made somebody mad with Columbus Day earlier this week. But we ain't going to get into that. The term that comes to mind is called Columbusing, and that is the idea of discovering something that's always been there and portraying it or introducing it to others as if it's something new or it's a new idea. And I think that happens in Western society. And frankly, that's what I try to avoid with having this conversation, because I felt like I was doing that with the term Latinx. When I discovered it, I'm like, all right, bet. So I'm all right, I understand. I'm hearing about it. This is the new term and that's it. And then this term comes along and I had to check my own biases to say, okay, well, hold on a second. Just as you talk about, language implications for African Americans and, the other identities that I hold, I have to be just as thoughtful and intentional about this too. And I can't Columbus this situation, right? And act like it's new just because I've discovered it. And I always say, just because you're starting the conversation doesn't mean the conversation has just started. And so I appreciate hearing that, because I think that it speaks to how even a progressive person that considers himself to be diverse, equitable, and inclusive can still get caught up in some of those Western ideals. Gabe.
And I was going to give huge kudos to Sandy for mentioning that, because it's something that I discovered as well during my studies as an undergraduate. I remember I was able to get my minor in LGBTQ studies that just ended up coming about because I didn't realize, I took a class here and I could actually apply that continuously. Yeah. And originally my intention behind it was to challenge masculinity within our Hispanic culture. But come to find out in these classes, what I'm learning is that the roots of the LGBTQ community span so far back in history, and people tend to forget that. And it's not just within the US structure, the indigenous tribes, some of the methods they had were corresponded to what people do now or how people identify. It may have just been a little different, but it's so accurate to what happens now. And I think that's something that people need to remember, that if this is being brought up, it's for a reason. It either exists or has been existing, because these terms, it doesn't just come out of thin air. Right. And we really have to remember that this really does go back further than people think. It really takes just, whether it's doing a little research or reading something or even taking a class, you really tend to find out just how far back things like this go.
Yeah, and then just to touch up base, I myself did a little research too. I think I learned something, and I think, this is the beauty about the language, and that we're not trying to change anything. And if anything, I think it's beautiful how, like you mentioned, even doing that research, or just as being curious as how we self-identify, we're tracing this back all the way to our indigenous roots, which, coming from being born and raised in Mexico, and my grandmother was actually part of an Aztec tribe, which I feel bad for not knowing the name or the research, but I'm getting there. I'm doing the work. But her first language was actually a dialect, which is Nahuatl, which is actually really well known in a lot of states back home in Mexico. And we tend to, with everything that goes on, as you said, as far as Colombia's, what was
Columbusing?
Columbusing, yeah.
Right? Just to kind of bring you guys back just a little bit, before we were Latinas or Latinos, there were already things in our culture that helped us identify and kind of just go into our society or, our little communities and already be inclusive. No one looked away on you, or no one kind of, turned you away for being who it was that you were. And they let you choose that. There's a tribe out here, actually, in the U.S., and I learned this recently in humanities class, which is, shout out to humanities. They have a practice where a young kid at the age of 7, when they are fully developed in their brain and they know what they want, they'll put a arrow and a basket, and they let him decide what he wants to do. If he chooses the arrow, he will be out there hunting, gathering. If he chooses the basket, he'll stay home, weave, and just help out. And they believe that it's okay for you to have two spirits. And if you came in as a male vessel and your second spirit happens to be female, you can live and walk life as such. And when you return back to the ground, you go back as the vessel you came in. And so I thought that was extremely interesting, just because we forget that, like, again, Latino, as far as that term, or Latina, are originally derived from the Latin words Latinus. And that refers to being an inhabitant of Asian Latium, which is the origin in central Italy. And we're having a conversation now, and we understand that while it's important to change the term so we can be more inclusive, times do change, and we try to adapt. And as we say, this is a continuous conversation, and it's not that we're trying to change the language at all. I just find it how it's so beautiful that we can do the research, trace it back, and eventually we get to these beautiful, findings where we try to bring back to light that at the end of the day, it's important to go back to your indigenous roots, for me.
Yeah. Excellent point. You mentioned something that I want to expound on a little bit in terms of the language changing, time changing, and advancing and growing the conversation. I think I'm reminded of the growing DEI acronym. And we've talked about this on the pod before, but it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now it's DEIB, diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging, DEIAB, which is accessibility, J, which is justice. There's a growing acronym to the point where I've started to refer to it as DEI plus, because at first I was against the acronym and I thought that it was a little too much, but now I've come to embrace it a little bit more. I think I've been inspired by the LGBTQIA plus community because they've embraced the growing acronym and seeing the affirmation in all of the identities. And so I think as it relates to the DEI space, I'm starting to see and affirm all of the different components that go into creating a culture of inclusion and engagement and belonging. However, is there a point where this grows too much? In another year or 2 years, are we talking about 2 or 3 more terms now that have come up, whether they have a historical basis to them or whether someone actually did come up with it out of thin air? At what point does it grow to the point where we may not be able to wrap our arms around it anymore? Is there a certain breaking point in terms of the identifier?
I don't think there's going to be a certain breaking point. I think what will happen is if it expands so largely, we're going to then have to adapt to a new term, right? And it actually brings us
like all encompassing?
Just like all encompassing, okay. Right? Because if we actually wanted to, say if somebody asked us like, what's an alternative to Latinx and Latina, right? You could use the quote unquote argument that, Hispanic and Latin are gender neutral themselves, right? Or people who specifically identify with their native country, right? So it could be, I'm Mexican American, right? Or, I feel like there's other ways that people can self-identify that don't have to be these terms. But if it does get ever to a point where it seems like it's too much, I don't think there's such thing as too much. I just think there is, now we have to refine it. We have to refine it just because there's so much in this world that's going to be left to discover. And for us to put a limitation on that puts a limitation on not only our imagination, but what we as humans can do.
That's a word. That's a word. Yeah. Excellent point.
Yeah. I mean, okay, 2 things. I'm kind of all over the place, but one thing that I think is very important to highlight is I'm sure we all know how important language is, right? In terms of, just being mindful, right, of how you are coming across in terms of empathy and compassion, right? We know language matters, right? And so that this idea, right, made me think about how this is exactly what we're doing with these terms in terms of trying to heal, and it's a form of liberation in one way, because we've been historically excluded, and I do think that we should do whatever we deem as best for us. Right. Just use whatever you want to use. Yep. If that's how you identify, cool, do that, right? And just respect if I want to use Latina because I identify as Latina, right? Personally, for me, in a general, for a general way, for instance, for like for workshop purposes, I will probably use Latinx or Latina, right? But if I'm talking to an audience where I don't know, right, I will do my best to use Latino, Latina, Latinx, Latina, right, to try to connect with my audience. But I think that overall, if anything, language is very beautiful. It's powerful. We know that our words hold a lot of power, and this is just in a different way.
The great segue into the final topic. What can the institution do specifically to be mindful of how we refer to Latin identities? I go back to the story I told before in terms of some of our official communications that go out, when our president does official communications, when they come out of my office, HR, and so on. I'm not necessarily asking for a straight answer, but more so just thoughts and recommendations on how we can be mindful of the language that we use to make sure that we're affirming identities. Help us out. Give us some recommendations as an institution on that.
I can go ahead and start that. I guess, just to comment on what you said, there isn't really no right or wrong answer, but I think more than anything, consistency and sensitivity is key. And I say that just because, there's obviously preferences in the community where people, identify under certain or a certain term. I feel like institutions or, even not just here, but in the workplace, they should engage more with the community as far as the workplace goes, and kind of understand their needs and preferences, see where they stand. It's easier said than done, but with again those two, consistency and sensitivity, maybe provide training resources for staff, students, on the importance of inclusive and language, which is important, because it has an extremely huge impact on identity and how it shapes who you are. Maybe encourage open dialogues, like I mentioned earlier, the fact that we were given this space to have this conversation, that it's already a step forward, I think. And maybe review a regular review and update language policies to reflect, evolving societal norms or values, per se. But I think that's for sure a start. But again, it's easier said than done. And I think that maybe institutions should strive to use more of a gender neutral language in their communications if it's possible. We don't have to go straight, to the top and then just change every single paperwork on file. But, again, doing the research and understanding who your audience is, that's a big help. Policies, or even, when something that can document to reflect the diversity also as well of the communities that they're working with. Because again, I remember growing up and having to fill out a form, and it's just a box, it isn't really much for you to pick out of other than a few terms.
You got to think outside of that box.
Yes, sir. Yeah.
I don't know. I'm still struggling, right? Because, I didn't even know about the DEIB plus, and then all of that. But of course, right? Because of course. But then it just makes me think about how we want to be careful about that in terms of how we are supporting students and creating spaces and platforms for our students to feel like they belong, and that this is, for them to feel empowered, to feel brave, because it takes me back to my alma mater, and when we had different centers for different identities across the campus. We had a women's center. We had a LGBTQIA center. We had the Latina Resource Center. We had the Asian American Resource Center, and it was under the umbrella of the Diversity Center, the Angelina Pedroso Center. And then because of funding, right, they had to cut down on these programs, right? And it just makes me think that I wish that we still had those, right? But monies, right? And so I don't ever want it to become this thing where, okay, everyone just, right, like just go to the CCID, right? Like we all do deserve specific spaces to where we can go in terms of where we best self-identify, right? So the dream is to have a center for all of these identities and not just lump it all in one, because then, okay, well, remember, I'm not just Latina, I'm also, I also identify as a woman, right? And where are those resources for that? So I don't know if that makes sense, but those are the things that come to mind, because then we make, yes.
Absolutely.
This is a discussion that's currently being had in the LGBTQ plus Latinx space online. And I know online isn't a representative of real life, but I understand it is an ongoing discussion. I can't say I'm not part of that community, but watching, they haven't, or like, not they, because I don't want to I don't know. I'm just gonna say we haven't decided on a like, this is the term we want. So there's not gonna be like a I feel like it would be really hard right now to be like, okay, do this, or use this, or have that final decision. And I saw someone who I thought it was a good idea, or at least like I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Is like when you're speaking in like English, Latinx is a good term to just be like gender neutral. It's like a term you can call Latinx people. And then in Spanish, you use Latine because it is easier to conjugate and just put into the already made language. And I also feel like it's like, yeah, I like that idea, me personally. And I feel like it definitely helps with the evolution of language, because language is always changing. I mean, we're not speaking the same type of English that, it was spoken in Europe in the 1600s. It is a different language. There are new terms. And I understand, and maybe we could use Latinx too, as in like, I mean, look at English. It is an amalgamation of like Latin and Germanic, and I think another one that I'm blanking on. It's like 3 different language origins all being combined into one, and so I'm not. Wow. And so eventually, yeah, like maybe 4,000 years in the future, Latin America will be speaking a different form of Spanish, or a completely new language for that like has its basis in English. I mean, in Spanish, and then has different influences from other languages. Languages, I think, is always evolving, and I like that idea. Like that me personally, I think I will be using Latine in Spanish and Latinx in English.
I wanted to bring up a point that you said, in that I think you said something along the lines of, I know it doesn't count as much because it's an online space, but I think there is a certain validity when it comes to online spaces, because you have to remember who's online the most, and that is the youngest, that is Generation Alpha and like the youngest Gen Z. Mm-hmm. And so while how they view the world is going to be different than how people have been viewing the world for years. Like, I've seen this discussion many times with queer people online, that the discussions and debates that happen within the queer community do not equal what happens in real life. However, it does still affect the queer community, because this younger generation, they're going to use this knowledge and they're going to use it to a day-to-day basis. Like, and I believe that language in an online space is extremely important, because these kids, these teenagers, they're going to take this language and they're going to use it in their day-to-day lives. So I think online spaces do have that validity because of that reason. And then the other thing I wanted to bring up, going back to ensuring inclusivity and how we refer to Latin identities, I think a great way to ensure inclusivity would be to bring about the culture and the pop culture within Latin communities, because that's something I realized that brings people together the most, is being able to relate around the culture of being Latino, Latina, or Latinx. And I specifically see it like with Latina groups, in which like we all have like this this kind of bond with each other. Like, we understand each other's experiences, and we understand each other's trying to find the word for it, like chisme. Chisme is very popular with Latinas. Yeah. And so like that's kind of like a way, like no matter where you're from, that's how we kind of like grow together as a society. It's just like by embracing each other's cultures, finding the commonalities and the differences.
Yep.
Yeah.
I like that you mentioned the internet space, because I feel that people tend to forget that sometimes that is people's safe space, and it's actually something that's just...
It's their whole world.
It's their whole world.
Yeah.
And from Reddit threads to Discord threads, like there's so many communities that people that don't even know exist. Everything from fandoms to even book culture to, like you mentioned, like queer communities, right? Because that's where they're able to interact and feel safe, because we've known what's happened in the world trying to do that outside sometimes could be put at risk because you don't know who's out there. But that online aspect is super strong, and it's only going to continue to grow because that is sometimes people's only safe space. And at least to address the question of what the college could do, right? For me, it really matters for me is that we are not only using whatever term seems appropriate, but from what I see, it's what are we doing to enforce that these terms are not just being used just for, publicity or just for material, right? I always tell the students, especially in the ANDALE meeting, you guys tell me what you all tell me what you want to do, and we're going to do it. We're going to make it happen. And I give them that freedom because it's for them, right? It's all for them. If they want to use a specific word, specific vocabulary, if they want to do a specific event that revolves around the community or a specific community, you tell me and we're going to make it happen, because I don't want the term just to be a driving factor to, we're inclusive because we have this term.
Right.
We're inclusive because we have this term and because we're showing the work.
That's right. Mm-hmm. And that's a great way to end our discussion. Thank you for being here today. I truly appreciate the opportunity to engage with you, to hear your voices, and to learn as well. So much of the work we do as practitioners is assisting in the learning and development of the people that we work with. It's also good for me to sit in the seat of a student today and hear about some things that I didn't know a whole lot about, which was why we asked you to be on the show. So thank you. I really appreciate you. And thanks for coming to the Critical Conversations Podcast Universe today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.